Hi everybody, welcome to Module 5. We're going to talk about teaching children with autism using applied behavior analysis throughout this module. We started to talk about applied behavior analysis last week in class, but if you're looking for more information to understand what ABA is, I've included two links here on the main screen. I'll post those in the D2L folder as well so you can access those easily. They're two brief videos about 7 minutes in length for each that explain. The first one is a historical perspective, an explanation of what applied behavior analysis is, and the second one is a day in the life of a person who practices applied behavior analysis. What we're going to cover in this module includes a definition of ABA, looking at the principles of behavior, and how we can use applied behavior analysis to teach students with autism new skills. One more, how we can use ABA to address challenging behaviors. So what is ABA? Applied behavior analysis is the utilization of the basic principles of learning and motivation to address socially important problems. Basically, we're using the principles of science to address socially significant challenges that kids with autism and adults with autism face. ABA is not only used in the field of autism, it's used for many other things. HR departments often employ behavior analysts to help motivate employees and to change the behavior of employees. Sometimes we want to increase motivation. Sometimes we want to decrease behaviors that are presenting challenges in the workforce, and ABA can work there. It can work to modify behaviors that are challenging in people's lives, things like smoking, things like weight loss. So ABA is used in many different fields, but the one it's most notable for is autism. And as we talked about in class last week, one of the reasons for that is because the US Surgeon General recommends ABA as the only treatment for behavioral issues associated with autism. Okay, so in order for us to understand how ABA works, we have to have a basic understanding of the principles of behavior. And there are three main points to understand. One is that all behavior is learned. We learn in two different ways, through classical conditioning and through operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is essentially timing, understanding that things go together. If you remember from intro psych, Pavlov's dog associated the ringing of a bell with the presentation of food. And after time and that association of those two things, the bell ringing and the food being brought out, occurring so close together, the dog didn't even need the food to be present and he'd already be drooling. So salivation was happening just from the sound of the bell alone. We learn a lot through timing in everyday life. The other way that we learn is through operant conditioning, and operant conditioning is learning through, with the help of reinforcement and punishment, which is something that was introduced in Module 4. The second thing we have to understand is that all behavior serves a purpose, something that we also looked at last week when we were talking about the function of behavior and using functional behavior assessments to understand what purpose a behavior serves. Functions vary from person to person. Some functions include escape, avoidance of a task, attention, or to get something tangible. Something like food or access to a preferred activity. Another purpose a behavior can serve is self-soothing or self-stimulation. So those are two things. And the third is that all behavior is contextual, which is what the entire Module 4 talked about when we looked at contextually inappropriate behaviors. So behavior can be influenced by the environment in which it occurs. Sometimes that's referred to as the trigger for behavior. So for instance, every time you're around your friend Joe, you get into trouble. That's a trigger for antecedent events. Remember, that's the A in the ABC of a behavior contingency. Antecedent events are events that happen immediately before a behavior occurs. So those are the three things that we have to keep in mind as we learn about the principles of behavior and how ABA is applied. So we can use ABA to teach new skills. And I'm going to go through just a list of the types of practices that we can use to teach new skills. These terms aren't going to make much sense until we talk about each one, and we will discuss each one individually. But some of the techniques that we can use are discrete trial training, also known as discrete trial teaching or discrete trial instruction. You might see DTT as an acronym for this, or DTI if it's being labeled a slightly different way. Errorless learning is a technique that we use, error correction, discrimination training, shaping, chaining, modeling, and the other technique that we use is verbal behavior to teach people with autism how to increase their communication skills. So as we move forward, we're going to talk about each one of these 8 techniques individually, starting with DTT. Discrete trial training is used to teach new skills on the basis of the 3-term contingency. So the 3-term contingency is antecedent, behavior, consequence. And in this example, the antecedent is the instruction, say car. So imagine I'm working with a child with autism. I say to that child, say car. So we're practicing verbal skills, imitation skills. The behavior that I am looking for the child to emit is saying the word car. And if he or she does that, the consequence is I give them access to a little Matchbox car and they're able to play that. So what we expect based on this 3-term contingency is that if access to that little Matchbox car is a reinforcer, if the child likes that, next time someone says, say car, there's a very high likelihood that the student will do that. So discrete trial training is based on this. There are 3 steps to discrete trial teaching in which the teacher or instructor gives an instruction, you wait for the learner to emit the behavior, and then the consequence is given. This is done within the context of 7-step sequence. So we get everything ready. So let's say I'm going to keep using that example of say car. So we have to have the little Matchbox car there. We have to have space for the learner and the instructor. It should be clear space, so it shouldn't be distracting in any way. We get everything ready. We get the student's attention. So we have to make sure the student isn't off gazing somewhere else when we begin instruction. We present the discriminative stimulus, which is the antecedent, the instruction. So in the last example, it was say car. And if a prompt is needed, so for instance, if the student does not start to repeat, we could prompt them by saying K, beginning the answer, and in the hopes that they would repeat it. And then once they emit the behavior, the target behavior, we reinforce that. If they respond incorrectly, we correct their behavior, and we'll talk about that in a few slides from now. And then we collect data, and the collection of data is really important. Data is collected for every trial and discrete trial training, and there could be hundreds in a session with a child. So you're not just doing say car, there might be 50 different things that you're practicing, you repeat them, you do it with different instructions, and with each trial, there's data recorded, and the data includes whether or not the behavior was emitted correctly and whether a prompt was used. If a prompt was needed, what type of prompt was used is also recorded. So some things that you have to keep in mind: you always have to have instructional control before starting the trial. So you always have to make sure that the student you have the student's attention and everything is ready to go. You have to make sure that each step in the 3-term contingency, the antecedent, behavior, and consequence are separate. You don't want to rush anything or begin to give the consequence, the reinforcer, for instance, as the behavior is occurring. So it's done individually, separately, but as soon as the behavior is complete, you want to reinforce it immediately. And as you're reinforcing the behavior, so for instance, as the child is playing with the car for 15 to 30 seconds, you're going to clear the space and get ready for the next trial. You want to keep the time in between those trials, which is called the inter-trial interval. You want to keep that really short. And if the child makes a mistake, you can just start it over again. You want to use error correction procedures and make sure as much as possible that the student is not practicing their behavior incorrectly. So we don't want them to make errors. And in fact, that's why we use this technique called errorless learning. And errorless learning is used in discrete trial teaching and throughout different techniques used in applied behavior analysis to ensure that the learner achieves success the first time. So we want them to succeed because we want them to access the reinforcer as much as possible, because remember, the purpose of the reinforcer is to increase the likelihood that the student's going to be able to do the behavior on their own in the future. So we use a series of prompts and prompt fading techniques to support learning. So we want to prompt them to be able to answer correctly, but we can't prompt them all the time. So we don't have prompts all the time in the real world. So as we prompt, we also want to begin to think about how we're going to decrease the use of prompts over time, because we want to avoid what's called prompt dependency. We see this in everyday behavior. If you help someone do something all the time, they're going to begin to rely on that help. In fact, they won't even initiate behavior on their own unless you give the prompt at some time. So we don't want to allow this dependency to start. But if we choose to use a prompt, we have to be very mindful of the type of prompt that we choose to use. Here's an example of 5 different prompts that you can use. And they range at the top, starting with the least invasive, the least intrusive, to the most intrusive. So up at the top, you're reaching independence. Down at the bottom, the learner is really dependent on the prompt being given by the instructor. So let's think about how each of these prompts work. A stimulus prompt could be something as simple as, if you had 3 items, let's say there was a little toy car, a little toy spoon, and a little toy pan. And you wanted to prompt the child to point correctly to the spoon. You could place the spoon closer than the other 2 items, and that would be suggesting or hinting, it's a hint, prompt is a kind of a hint to the learner that that was the correct answer. That's an example of a stimulus prompt. The other thing you could do is gesture to the correct answer to guide them. So if you saw the student about to point to the car, you could redirect them quickly to point to the spoon. That's an example of errorless learning. They're never responding with an error. Another thing you could do is model the behavior yourself. So you could model the correct behavior, point to spoon, and then you could have them do it. Partial physical prompt is if you guide them. For instance, you touch their hand and guide it to respond correctly. You're not holding their hand or moving it for them. That would be a full physical prompt where you guide with full direction the learner's physical body to answer and respond correctly. We want to, there are 2 different ways that you can use prompts, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. But no matter what type of prompt you're using, you always want to remember that over time, you want to decrease the use of that prompt because you don't want the learner to become dependent on your help. So we can do a couple of different things. We can prompt from most to least, not least it, that should be least, there's a typo there. We can prompt from least to most using the least intrusive method to the most intrusive. We could use graduated guidance, or we could use time delay. So let's talk about each of those different methods. Most to least, that's where we start with a more intrusive prompt. So something, for instance, like a full physical prompt or a partial physical prompt. And then as the learner is increasing in their independence, we use least intrusive prompts. So we could start with, for instance, a full physical prompt and then partial physical. We could then move to modeling, gestural and stimulus prompts. So we start with the most intrusive and then back off from there. Or we could move from a less intrusive prompt. So for instance, get the student to try on their own. And if we need more help, we could increase the prompt in terms of its reliance on you. So on how dependent the learner is. So we could move kind of from the top of that hierarchy that we just saw on the last slide to the bottom. A third type of prompting procedure that we could use is called graduated guidance. And that's when you move from a more to less physical support. So this is only used in physical prompting. It's kind of like we wait and guide physically as needed. And the fourth procedure that we could use is time delay. So instead of just prompting right away, we give a very short wait, about 5 seconds, and wait to see if the instruction, the discriminative stimulus, which is the antecedent in that 3-term contingency, if the learner responds, it begins to respond within that 5 seconds. If they don't, then we can prompt, but at least we've given them a chance to demonstrate their ability independently if they're able to do that. If a learner makes a mistake, we have to correct that error. We want the learner to understand what the correct and expected response is. So how do we do that? We clear our space where we're working. We do the instruction, give the instruction again, and we prompt. So we prompt to make sure that the learner avoids making a mistake. We reinforce that trial, and then we start the next one all over again. And we repeat this process until the learner can do the skill at the desired level. Typically, we want the learner to be able to repeat and demonstrate mastery of the skill multiple times before we're convinced that they've learned the skill. So let's say we are teaching 50 different things. We could repeat those 50 things in the course of a session 3 or 4 times. Another thing we want to do is not make every trial difficult. So we want to, in a series of trials, make sure we're reviewing things that the learner already knows. So we're going to insert easy trials in between prompted trials and repeat anything place that there's a mistake. Another technique that's frequently used in applied behavior analysis is called discrimination training. Discrimination training is especially used in receptive language as a foundation for future learners. So think about the word discrimination and what that means. It means figuring out, discriminating the difference between 2 or more things. So receptive language is comprehension, listening skills, and looking to see if a learner can understand and comprehend correctly the instructions that you're giving them. So point to green. If you have multiple cards with different colors, let's say you have red, blue, and green cards in front of you, point to green would be a prompt, a discriminative stimulus that would initiate a behavior where the learner is discriminating between the different colors that are in front of them. So we present the learner with 2 or more items. In the example that I just gave, I used 3 items as the example. We ask the student to receptively identify the thing that was named in the instruction. And we use errorless learning techniques in the beginning to prompt the learner and to make sure that they're answering correctly and they're not practicing mistakes. Shaping can also be used, and shaping is a technique that's defined as reinforcing successive approximations of the desired behavior. So as a response becomes closer to the target, to what you want it to look like, we increase the level of reinforcement. It's a pretty technical definition, but when you think about a real-world example, it becomes much easier to understand. So let's say you are working with a student to say your name. So my name is Christine. I want the student to be able to say my name. And when we start, the student can only say the first sound, k, k. We reward that. We reinforce that. It's making an approximate behavior that we know is close and will get closer to the target. And perhaps it gets closer with more trials, and we go from k to kr every time, and we would reinforce that step that the learner is taking in getting closer to the target. We would even reinforce that more, and we would continue to do that and shape the behavior until the behavior ultimately looks like what our target is defined as. We do this with lots of different things. We can do it with, we see it done in sports all the time. So if you've ever learned how to swing a baseball bat, probably the first time you did it, it didn't look so great. And as you did it in successive repetitions, whoever was teaching you to swing the bat would correct it and would expect it to get closer to ultimately what swinging a bat should look like. So that's another example of a behavior being shaped. Handwriting is also something. So when you're teaching students how to write the letters of the alphabet, in the beginning they might not look exactly like what you want them to, but over time their behavior becomes closer to what you want the target to be. And as their responses become more proficient and more independent, we continue to increase the levels of reinforcement. Okay, so we're moving through that list of 8 things. We've talked about discrete trial training. We've talked about errorless learning. We've looked at prompting and error correction, discrimination training, shaping, and now we're going to look at chaining in the last 3 techniques. So chaining, modeling, and verbal behavior are the last 3 techniques that we're talking about in conjunction with using applied behavior analysis to teach students with autism. So chaining is used to teach multiple steps. We begin the process of thinking about the behavior that we'd like to teach. Let's say, for instance, we are teaching a student how to brush their teeth. We have to break that behavior. So brushing teeth is one thing, but we have to break that down into multiple steps using a task analysis. And a task analysis is just the process of doing that, of breaking something down. That's easier said than done. It's really difficult sometimes to think about every little step involved in a behavior. We're going to actually practice that in class this week. And then you can use either forward chaining. So you begin the instruction with the first step and you start with the instruction, or you could begin the instruction with the last step in the chain, and that's backward chaining. And the final thing that you could do is do the entire, all of the steps, train each step during every session. We're going to look at examples of this. This is something that is you need practice with to understand the difference between forward, backward, and total task. And we'll talk about different situations in which the techniques are more and less appropriate depending on what you're trying to teach. But right now, having kind of a preview of the 3 different types of chaining is what's important. Modeling is number 7 on that list of ABA techniques that can be used to teach students with autism. Modeling is exactly what it sounds like. It's also known as imitation training. You demonstrate a skill as the teacher, and you expect the learner to imitate the skill that you've demonstrated. Modeling can happen in lots of different ways. It could be a live model. It could be written instructions that help model the behavior. It could be a visual, for instance, like a chart that walks you through steps, or it could be an audio model. But in order to use this, your learner has to have some prerequisites in place. So the learner has to be able to attend to the model. So they have to have the attention skills necessary to be able to follow along with what the model is doing. The learner has to be able to recall the behavior to be reproduced. So they have to have good enough memory skills to be able to remember what was just done before them. And they have to physically be able to perform the behavior. So for instance, if someone modeled a back handspring for me, I would not have the prerequisite skills to be able to imitate that. So we have to remember that in order to teach something, through modeling, the learner has to be able to perform the behavior in order for imitation to work. And verbal behavior is the last technique. So verbal behavior is what we're teaching, and we're teaching it using a technique called verbal behavior. There are 4 unique kinds of skills that can be learned through verbal behavior training: echoic skills, man skills, tact skills, and intraverbal skills. So we'll go through each one. An echoic skill is just an imitation, where you say something and you want the learner to practice saying it back to you. So the antecedent in an echoic skill is saying something like, say car. The behavior is the imitation of the word that you just said, and what the learner gets in response for doing that is a social reinforcement. A mand is just a demand, asking for something. So the antecedent is desire or motivation. So for instance, hunger or thirst. The behavior is making that request. So I'm hungry, may I have a drink of water? And the consequence is getting that item as a result. So the reinforcement for being able to make a demand is getting that demand met. A tact is being able to label or point to something in the environment. So the stimulus for this is having something in the environment. It's nonverbal, something that's present. The behavior that's the response is a verbal behavior. So you point to something. So this is sitting on the desk. You say phone, and that gains you either access to that phone or the ability to communicate, and with the consequence of understanding that you're able to share in your interests with others. The last type of verbal behavior that we can teach using applied behavior analysis is called intraverbal. And intraverbal is reciprocated communication. So conversation. The initiation, the antecedent for intraverbal teaching is someone asks you a question. It's someone else's verbal behavior. So they say, what's your name? You respond with verbal behavior. My name is Christine. And then the consequence is social. The reinforcement is that you're able to engage in a conversation with someone. So those are all really important techniques that help increase our learners with autism ability to communicate with others, which we know is a big challenge for our students with autism. The final thing in this module is how we can use applied behavior analysis to address challenging behavior. And this is really what we focused on in Module 4, where we talked about contextually inappropriate behavior, how we can identify the function of it, and then how we can use our understanding of the function of that behavior to modify it. And that's what ABA is all about. So we identify the function of the challenging behavior. So think about some of those examples that we saw in Super Nanny, right? We saw primarily the function of the behavior that we were watching amongst those families was kids really wanting to gain attention, the attention of their parents. And some other common things that we saw in those videos were access to tangible items like food or iPad, electronics, things like that. Once we know the function of the behavior, what we can do is we can use the principles of behavior. So those 3 things that we talked about way back in the beginning of the chapter: all behavior is learned, all behavior serves a purpose, and all behavior is contextual. So we can use our understanding of those 3 principles to systematically teach or shape replacement behaviors. So we're not just going to say we are going to end this challenging behavior. We're going to teach the learner how to do something in place of that challenging behavior so that their life isn't as disrupted as it had been in the past. So in sum, applied behavior analysis is a process of teaching our kids with autism functional skills to replace behaviors that are challenging, to increase behaviors that allow the students to navigate more functionally in everyday life, and to do that throughout many facets of every day. So it can be done in the home and it can be done in school, can be used to help teach recreational activities, and can be used anywhere that we see our kids have challenges. We're going to continue to talk about this in class this week. We're going to begin with talking about functions of behavior and continuing our conversation that we started with watching those episodes of Super Nanny and the Goins family. And we'll wrap up with a summary of not only this module, Module 5, but going back and looking at any questions that you may have before taking the exam next week. So this rounds out the content that will be covered in the first exam on chapters or modules 1 through 5.